Hello, my name is Isidora Stojanovic, and today I will be talking about pejoratives. The material that I will present today is largely based on a joint paper with Bianca Cepollaro and Filippo Domaneschi entitled When is it okay to call someone a jerk? An experimental investigation of expressives, and published earlier this year in Synthese. Let me start by giving you an overview of the motivations and aims of our work. Consider an utterance such as, that bastard Connor got promoted. Bastard and similar expressions like jerk, asshole are what we call pejoratives. Most existing accounts of pejoratives predict that utterances such as this one, that the use of pejoratives in such utterances is felicitous and acceptable if the speaker has a negative attitude toward the person referred to, so in this example, Connor, and that this should be so regardless of whether this is known to the audience or whether the audience has also a negative attitude towards this person or whatever else may be the case in the common ground of the context. So what we have tried to do is test whether this prediction is empirically satisfied, and we have conducted an experimental study which ends up challenging this widely shared assumption. So, what we think our study shows is that pejoratives impose certain interesting constraints on the context of use. So, what I want to do in this talk today is present the study and discuss its implications as well as some further issues raised by pejoratives. Here is a plan for this talk. I'll start with some preliminaries, one regarding taxonomy, another regarding the projective behavior of pejoratives. I'll give an overview of the existing accounts of pejoratives, and then distinguish between referential and predicative uses of pejoratives. Then we will see three hypotheses about the felicity or the acceptability of uses of pejoratives. I will then present our study, present its result, and discuss what they show with respect to the various hypotheses that we have on the use of pejoratives. In the last part of the talk, I will tell you about the follow-up study that we ran and discuss some further issues. Let me start by some taxonomy. There is unfortunately no consensus on the use of various terms. This talk is going to focus on words like bastard, asshole, jerk, or because our study is on Italian, the pejorative stronzo, that's an equivalent of jerk. I'll be calling those pejoratives. They're also sometimes called epithets or insults, and they're to be sharply distinguished from another type of derogatory expression that has received a lot of interest in the recent literature in philosophy, namely slurs. Slurs, racial and ethnic slurs. So frog is a slur, for example, for French. The N-word is a very offensive slur. There are slurs for sexual orientation and so on. So what distinguishes these two types of expressions is that pejoratives, they derogate only the person for whom they are used on a given occasion, whereas slurs are in a certain sense much more derogatory, because by using a slur for a person on a given occasion, the speaker and the use of the slur derogates the whole community that is to which the person belongs. So in the case of racial slurs, it is the whole race or sexual orientation and so on. So let me note that this is not necessarily a very neat division. It's an important division because we have two types of paradigmatic expressions on the two sides, but expressions such as bitch could be seen both as pejoratives, as an equivalent of, say, bastard or jerk, but it has been also shown that this expression can be seen as a gender slur derogating women in general. Now, it's not going to be important for this talk that we have a neat division. We are really going to focus just on the paradigmatic examples of pejoratives. Both slurs and pejoratives, they belong among derogatory expressions, and derogatory expressions can include further expressions which are not necessarily pejoratives of slurs, so shithole would be an example. Both slurs and pejoratives belong among expressives, occasionally I'll be using the word expressive to refer to pejoratives. So why have pejoratives been of interest to linguists? Because of their projective behavior. So if you look at sentences 1 to 5, I'm going to read them quickly. It's not true that that bastard Connor got promoted. Did that bastard Connor get promoted? If that bastard Connor gets promoted, then Shelley will resign. Jim thinks that that bastard Connor got promoted. Someone has told me that the bastard Connor got promoted. So in all these sentences, the pejorative occurs in environments that are entailment cancelling. So if there is an expression in such an environment, what it entails is not entailed by the whole sentence. The expression occurs embedded under operators such as the negation, or in 4 and 5 we have doxastic operators, things that, and we have speech reports like told me that. But what is interesting is that the derogatory content towards Connor in all 5 sentences is still conveyed by those sentences, even though the expression occurs in such environments. So to use a linguistic jargon, the derogatory content of pejoratives systematically projects, and as we see in 4 and 5, so those are environments such that very often a presupposition is cancelled in those environments, but we see that with pejoratives they seem to, as we say, hyper-project. So if you say Jim thinks that that bastard Connor got promoted, the derogatory attitude towards Connor is not confined to what Jim thinks. It seems to go beyond and to be part of what you communicate by uttering for. So I will not be talking much about the projective behavior of pejoratives in this talk, but it is important to have in mind that this is probably the feature that in the beginning got a lot of triggered a lot of interest in those expressions, and that can be relevant to some of the things that we are going to see later on. Let me now just briefly sketch the existing accounts of pejoratives. There has been some discussion. There was a preliminary discussion of those in David Kaplan's published monograph. It's just a manuscript on oops and ouch in 1999, but it's we can't really speak of a semantic account of pejoratives there. It is in the following years that we get proposals, properly semantic proposals on how to treat pejoratives. So Christopher Potts' influential book from 2005 takes pejoratives to be triggers of conventional implicatures, so that when you have use of a pejorative such as that bastard Connor, what happens there is that such an utterance will trigger a conventional implicature to the effect that the speaker holds the referent in low opinion or has a negative attitude toward the referent. There is a relatively similar account put forward by Giuseppe Massia in a paper from 2002, though the paper is in Spanish, so that may explain why it may not have been so influential. And then Philippe Schlenker's paper from 2007 on expressive presuppositions. So their account is in a way similar to Pott's, but what they claim is that it is not a conventional implicature, rather it's a presupposition that pejoratives trigger. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with conventional implicatures and presuppositions, there are some tests which are meant to distinguish these kind of mechanisms, but for our purposes today, the difference between the two is not particularly important. What we should keep in mind simply is that on Messiaen and Schlenker account, pejoratives trigger the presupposition that the speaker holds Conner-in-law opinion. And then there is an account from 2013 from Judith Tonhauser, David Beaver, Craigie Roberts, and Mandy Simons. So it's a paper which is not specifically about pejoratives. Their paper challenges the distinction between conventional implicatures and presuppositions and proposes a new taxonomy of projective content. Still, what they claim is that pejoratives they lack certain features which sometimes we see with presuppositions and conventional implicatures. Well, actually, much more with presuppositions, and that is the so-called strong contextual felicity constraint. So the idea is that there are expressions which have this feature, and basically such expressions cannot be felicitously used in a context when there is not a certain constraint on the common ground of the context, and other expressions which can be felicitously used without any such constraint. And so basically what Tonhauser and her colleagues propose is that, well, what they claim is that pejoratives can be felicitously used without any special constraints on the context of use. So this is this survey is extremely rough, but it is going to be enough for our purposes. The last thing to note in the preliminaries is that, as we've just seen, the existing account of pejoratives almost exclusively focus on what we can call referential uses of pejoratives. So uses where you have a term like bastard or jerk in an expression that is meant to refer to a particular person. So that bastard, the jerk, and so on. And this use can be contrasted with what we call predicative use, where we have something like Connor is a jerk. And this is also an interesting thing to note, because when you look at the literature on slurs, so the other type of derogatory expressions, there a lot of discussion really goes on predicative uses. So it is interesting that the predicative uses of pejoratives have not received much, if any, attention at all in the literature. So we did also look at those predicative uses, as we are going to see shortly. At any rate, so the distinction to retain is between pejorative used in a referential expression and it's being used in a predicative expression. So ref and pred are abbreviations that I'm going to adopt for the distinction. Let's move on to our study. So we can formulate three hypotheses on the acceptability of pejoratives. The first one is, so the three hypotheses will be replicated for referential and predicative uses. In the case of referential uses, the first hypothesis says that an utterance such as that bastard Connor got promoted, where we have a referential use of bastard, is acceptable both in neutral and satisfying contexts, where this difference between neutral and satisfying contexts will be clarified in a second. The second hypothesis is that it is acceptable in satisfying but not in neutral context. And the third is that it is never acceptable. And similarly, for an utterance such as Connor is a jerk, H1 star says that it is acceptable both in neutral and satisfying context. H2 star that it is acceptable in satisfying but not in neutral context, and then H3 star that it is never acceptable. So let me start by clarifying this difference between satisfying and neutral context. We say that the context is satisfying, or also that it is a positive context. I will be using terms satisfying and positive interchangeably. When given an expression that has a certain context C, the context or what is known in this context, the information in the common ground, entails C. So in other words, context is positive or satisfying when it is already part of the information known in this context that C is the case. And we say that the context is neutral if this information neither entails C nor does it entail not C. Okay, so the three accounts of pejoratives that we've seen earlier, namely the conventional implicature account, the presupposition account, and then the Tannhauser and her colleagues' account, which says that pejoratives don't impose a strong contextual felicity constraint. So all three accounts clearly predict H1, namely the hypothesis that use of pejoratives should be felicitous or acceptable, both in satisfying and neutral accounts. Now, acceptability, we take that to be a pre-theoretical concept, and there is, of course, more than one understanding of what is acceptable. Something can be acceptable from a linguistic point of view, but not from, say, a social point of view. So what we hope to track with the notion of acceptability in the study is linguistic acceptability, or what can also be referred to as felicity. And note that this is something that comes in degrees. Some things may be more acceptable than others, so it's not an all or nothing um, property or notion. So we still want to talk about something being acceptable or not acceptable, and what we implicitly understand is that when we say that the use of an expression is acceptable, that it is so over a certain contextually specified threshold, and similarly when we say that something is not acceptable, we mean that it is below a threshold for what is acceptable in a given context. So I think this will become more clear as we go on. Now let me move on to the study that we ran, and as I mentioned, so with my colleagues Bianca Cepollaro and Filippo Domaneschi, we ran a study on the Italian pejorative stronzo, which is an equivalent of jerk. It was an online study with 90 participants. They were all students, and the stimuli they were formed of a context scenario, which is a description of a context, and a series of 12 sentences. Of these 12 sentences, only one sentence was a target, and the other 11 were fillers or distractors. And we had 4 types of target sentences and 2 types of context scenarios. So the target sentences could contain a pejorative or a controller in either a referential or a predicative use, and then the context scenarios could be either satisfying or neutral. So in other words, it was an experimental design of 4x2, and it was run within subjects. So the variations were whether in the stimulus the context was one that was satisfying or neutral, and then whether the target sentence contained a pejorative or a controller, and whether this expression was in a predicative or referential use. So in this table, by simply putting pej or con, that is to be taken as pejorative in predicative use or controller in predicative use, whereas that pej and that con is that pejoratives is part of complex demonstratives such as that jerk blah, or that the controller is part of such a context of such a complex demonstrative. So to make things uh, uh, more smooth, let me give the examples of the sentences that we used. So pej would be something like Marco è stronzo, Marco is a jerk. That pej is quello stronzo di Marco è arrivato, that jerk Marco has arrived. And then a controller would be something like Marco è siciliano, Marco è Sicilian, whereas the that controller is quel siciliano di Marco è arrivato, that Sicilian Marco has arrived. So now let me give an example of the context scenarios that we used in our stimuli. So as I mentioned, they could be either satisfying or positive or neutral. And the difference was just in one sentence. So here is an example of a positive context. I will read directly the translation in English. So Sarah and Luca are at the graduation party. The host has invited Marco. Nobody stands him because of his arrogance. When Marco arrives at the party, Luca says to Sarah. And a neutral context would be exactly like that, without this sentence that we saw in blue, which makes it explicit that Marco is, so to speak, a bad person, or has done something bad, or in other words, deserves to be held in low opinion. So controller sentences were of a similar structure. So Sarah and Luca are at the graduation party. The host has invited Marco. Marco is Sicilian, and he brought a dessert typical of his place. When Marco arrives at the party, Luca says to Sarah. And then the target sentence would be, as mentioned, either in a referential or a predicative use, so something like Marco is Sicilian, or that Sicilian Marco has arrived. Again, for controller sentences, the neutral context is as a previous one, except that what we had in blue, which simply states the information that, say, Marco is Sicilian, is missing. So the procedure of the study was that the participants would read the description of the context, so this scenario, this 2 or 3 sentences, and then they would have 12 sentences for which they would rate their acceptability on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. Now remember that of the 12 sentences, only 1 was what we were interested in, namely the target, and then 11 were distractors. So by way of recap, so the study had a 2 by 2 by 2 variation, whether the context was satisfying or neutral, whether the expression that we had was a pejorative or a controller, and the controllers were expressions such as Sicilian, but also early riser and similar expressions of professions and so on. And then the third variation was referential versus predicative uses. So I'm moving now to results. If there are unclarities about the tasks and the study itself, it can of course be resolved during the question and answers period. But let me show what our study basically established. So this is what we got, and I am going to go step by step as to the different things that we have obtained with this study, that we see in this study. So on this graph, the red is for the pejoratives, for sentences containing stronzo, and the gray is for the controllers. And then we have the four the four cases are a positive predicative, neutral predicative, and then positive referential, neutral referential. So here is the first thing that we observed with the results, namely that the sentences with pejoratives are overall less acceptable than the sentences with controllers, except in one condition, namely that where we had a satisfying context or a positive context, and both the pejorative and the controller were used as part of a complex demonstrative, such as that jerk Marco or that Sicilian Marco. So in that condition, we see no difference. So that is the third that you have. But all the three others, the one that I've highlighted with red rectangles, are such that that in them we see a difference in acceptability. Now, what is probably the most important result of our study, and the one that we think really addresses the three hypotheses on the use, are the differences in acceptability that we see when we look at neutral context. So those are the two that we have now highlighted in red. As we're going to see in a short while, when we move from a positive to a neutral context, there is going to be a certain drop in acceptability, both for pejoratives and for their controllers. But what happens with pejoratives is that this acceptability drops, we could even say dramatically. So there is really a huge difference in the acceptability, depending on whether we are in positive, that is satisfying context, or in a neutral context. And we see that whereas with controllers, they are slightly less acceptable than in positive context, the pejoratives in a neutral context have really low acceptability. They still are judged acceptable, but only to a more or less 2 points on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. The third result worth stressing is that when we look at controllers in neutral context, the referential uses of controllers are judged less acceptable than the predicative uses. So if you have a context that doesn't specify anything about where Marco comes from, and you have something like that Sicilian Marco has arrived, that is judged less acceptable than saying that Marco is Sicilian. And so there is another interesting result that we see in our study is that when you look at positive context and at pejoratives there, both in predicative and in referential uses, um, their acceptability is very high. It is slightly lower than the acceptability of controllers in predicative uses, but still, when you look at the graph, so I've again highlighted this with red rectangles. We see that the acceptability of pejoratives in positive context is approximately 4. They are perfectly acceptable, as you might say. And so this is a graph that shows the result slightly differently. They're the same results, but a different graph, where now the blue is used for the positive context and the gray for the neutral context. And so last result that we observe in the study is that overall, both for pejoratives and controllers, and both for predicative and referential uses, the acceptability diminishes when you move from a positive to a neutral context. And this is so even for controllers. So if you have so if you have a sentence like Marco is Sicilian, it is judged as more acceptable in a context where this is already known than the one where there is no information to that effect. Now, this is an effect which is not particularly, so this kind of observation is not particularly new with this study, and sometimes this is attributed to an effect of priming, but it is still something noteworthy. So now let us, okay, here we are. Apologies for the interruption. So let us go back to our three hypotheses. The first one, that a sentence containing a pejorative is acceptable both in neutral and satisfying context. So we have that as H1 and H1 star regarding both referential and predicative uses. H2, that it is acceptable in satisfying but not in neutral context, and H3, that it is never acceptable. So what we see in the results is that they speak in favor of H2, the hypothesis that pejoratives are acceptable in satisfying but not so acceptable in neutral context, and they speak against H1 and H3. Now, we've seen that all sorts of expressions are less acceptable in neutral than in positive or satisfying context. We've seen that that's also the case for controllers. But what is particularly important to speak against H1 is that pejoratives are much less acceptable. So when you compare them to non-pejorative, and you see how their acceptability drops in neutral context, we see really a huge difference when it comes to pejoratives. And we take that to speak very strongly against H1, namely the hypothesis that is predicted by all the existing accounts of pejoratives, according to which we shouldn't really expect any such difference, and we should find the acceptability of pejoratives high in neutral context as well. Now, our results also show that in those cases, namely neutral context where pejoratives are not really acceptable, so this cannot be an effect of the fact that pejoratives are bad words, what you might call a taboo effect. Given that in a positive or satisfying context, pejoratives are perfectly acceptable. Actually, when you look at referential uses, pejoratives and their controllers are just equally acceptable. There is no difference whatsoever. So this speaks against a hypothesis which would predict that pejoratives just shouldn't be acceptable at all. Now, it is true that in the literature there are no, to our knowledge, no accounts that give that prediction, but in the literature on slurs, there are influential accounts, the so-called prohibitionist accounts, such as Anderson and Laporte's, which predict, which if they were to be applied to pejoratives, would give that prediction. And what we see is that pejoratives are not taboo words. In satisfying context, they are perfectly fine. Now, we mentioned some further results. So we've seen that in neutral context, uh, the referential uses of controllers are less acceptable than their predicative uses. So we see a difference. It is not a huge difference, but it is a significant difference between the two conditions. And we think that there could be two explanations. One is simply that we have a neutral, that we have a complex demonstrative, and when we move to a neutral context, so this requires a presupposition accommodation. So remember, the example would be something like that Sicilian Marco has arrived in a context in which it is not known that Marco is Sicilian, so that would require accommodating the presupposition that Marco is Sicilian. And another possible explanation could be that when you use something like that Sicilian Marco, this is pragmatically marked and might trigger a derogatory interpretation. So this is a possibility that we would like to explore in some future works. And then let me mention one last further result, namely that with predicative uses of pejoratives, we also see that the acceptability drops when we move to a neutral context. So remember that the literature on pejoratives focuses on referential uses. We have looked at predicative uses, and so we have noticed this interesting fact that when you compare them to controllers, pejoratives are less acceptable in a neutral context in their predicative uses. So one hypothesis would be that this could be due simply to the fact that you're predicating or saying something negative about someone. Now, this is something that we did want to look into, and this invited a follow-up study that I'm going to present now in what follows. So what we wanted to do in this follow-up study is make sure that we wanted to see whether the drop in acceptability in pejoratives in their predicative uses could be due, as I've just said, to the fact that you're saying something negative, whereas with the other controllers, there is no such negative predication. So what we did is to compare pejoratives with negatively balanced words. And the study that we ran was again in Italian. It had 103 participants, again students, and the stimuli consisted similarly as in our first study of a context scenario and the target sentence. Now this study was much simpler because it only had two conditions. In the target sentence, there was the the pejorative or a negatively balanced word, and those included words like antipatico, which is nasty, cattivo, mean, maleducada, rude, sleale, disloyal, odiosa, hateful, insopportabile, unbearable, and so on. So again, the task was to rate the acceptability on a 1 to 5 scale. And what we had were 8 stories and 11 and 12 fillers. So here is an example of a stimulus in study 2, quite similar to the ones we used in our first study. Sarah and Luca are at the graduation party. The host has invited Marco. When Marco arrives at the party, Luca says to Sarah, so we have Marco Estronzo, the one that we had in our first study, or something like Marco Antipatico. So here are the results of this follow-up study. Again, it's a fairly simple study. And we see a significant difference in acceptability. We see that pejoratives are much less acceptable than other nouns that are negatively balanced. So what this suggests is that this effect of lower acceptability is not simply due to saying something negative, but has something to do with the fact that we have an expression of the type pejorative or an expressive, as you might say. So to sum up, the existing accounts of pejoratives predict while they differ on some aspects, they converge on this prediction that when a speaker is using a term like that jerk, this should be acceptable in a context if the speaker holds the referent in low opinion, regardless of whether there is any background information about that or whether the other conversation participants share this attitude, or whether the referent deserves to be held in low opinion and referred to in such a way. And what we did with my colleagues Bianca Cepollaro and Filippo Domaneschi is run an experimental study which we claim this confirms this hypothesis and shows that the use of pejoratives is sensitive to contextual information to a much higher degree than other control items. We also see that what the study shows is that it's not just that pejoratives are bad words and in that respect unacceptable, because in appropriate context they're judged equally acceptable as other words, as their controllers. So this is how far we've got. We have some projects for further studies, namely to investigate the specific conditions that pejoratives impose on the constraints, but I leave this for discussion. Thank you so much for listening. Here are some selected references, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you again.
And yeah, I think we can get started with the questions. Robert?
Oh, I actually think Stefano was before me. I don't know if that.
Yeah, go ahead, Robert. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. So I was just wondering, it feels like, sorry if you already sort of answered this and I'm just being slow. So in the neutral examples that you gave, I was thinking about examples that I'm familiar with, so for example, saying that Londoner in the north of England is more pejorative than saying, that Londoner in London. So I was thinking about how, where you're from could affect how you like perceive others from other geographical locations. At least that's, that can be the case in the UK. So I was wondering if anything like that could be going on with like the Sicilian example. I'm not very familiar with it, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and it's a bit unfortunate that we already had. So the slides, I used this example in the slides, but it did occur to me that there could be something like some prototype associated with Sicilians, but we did discuss that with my colleagues, and so Filippo, who is our experimental person, he did all the comparison between the various controllers that we used. So there were among the controllers, there was also Piemontese, and so they used we used I think 3 of like regions in Italy. So and then he also compared it with other controllers that we used, and there were no effects specifically about Sicilian. So yeah, so that was also something that we, so as I mentioned in the results, we see this interesting thing that in neutral context, that Sicilian Marco is seen as a bit less acceptable, but it's not just about Sicilian. It was fairly stable across various controllers. And so there was, for instance, this early riser, which should be something perceived often as positive, but well, it was quite uniform across all the controllers. But it's a very fair question. Yeah, I think it would be interesting to then maybe run further studies which would control more specifically as to how various expressions which are not themselves pejoratives are likely to acquire a pejorative meaning, but that would be a different study. Yeah, I hope
Thank
it
you.
could,
Yeah, thank you.
Stefano?
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. So I might have one very quick follow-up to Robert and the proper question. So the quick follow-up is that the Robert's consideration might even probably be extended, so generalized. So where there are control sentences with in which the control was not on singling out a social category. Because it seems to me that with all the regions, still it's singling out broadly conceived social categories, which might imply that kind of negative feeling, especially because, I mean, since it seemed, I mean, it's in a context quite weird to stress this kind of features. The unexpected appearance of this kind of determiner might trigger some kind of whether.
Right. So shall I take this follow-up question first? Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't have here the whole list of controllers, but so I remember that there were regions, there were professions, and then there was like characteristics of like people. I think it is. It is really a legitimate concern, because I think all of our controllers were could be that there could be this pragmatic effect of something that, like, why all of a sudden are you using that in a demonstrative, like saying, that I don't know that. So yeah, like that pharmacist, blah blah, and so that's possibly that's precisely what explains why we get this lower acceptability in neutral context, because there is something pragmatically weird. And so so that's something that definitely should be tested. There were no like I don't know what would be really like a controller that would sound extremely natural. Maybe yeah, that I mean, because if you use like some very general categories like that girl or that boy, I think those two, even so, they're not specifically just, well, they could, I think they would probably generate the same effect. So it's unclear what would be the best thing to use. If you have suggestions.
Yeah, sure, I agree. It's very difficult to come out with an example. But I was just wondering. So, well, the most general concern, however, the one that maybe has some effects on the outcome of the experiment, especially, pertains to the setting. When you presented the setting, I think it's slide 19, and the procedure in particular. The question task, well, it's in Italian, but it's roughly translated as, how much do you think these sentences are acceptable? So, quanto ritieni accettabili queste frasi? So what I was wondering about is, you clearly you gave even a very brief, but still you gave a specification of acceptability. Was such a specification, even in some sense, given to the subjects?
No, so the test, so that was, it's also a very legitimate concern. It's one that we pondered about, how one should phrase the question. So we did not want to give specifications, because so we really sort of tried to get something that they would take as a pre-theoretical notion, because as soon as you were to give them, like, say something, you know, like a sentence is acceptable if blah 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 and so on, it can bring some noise to the study. So we were hesitating about how to formulate the sentence, because things like how felicitous it is less natural, even though maybe that's what the notion that we were after was more that of felicity, but it wasn't precisely the good way of phrasing that. So then we decided to phrase it in this way, because there are other studies which are not specifically about evaluative discourse, but more about presuppositions, where it's phrased in those terms, in terms of acceptability. So we just went on with that. But it is definitely, I mean, it is a concern as to how what you can deduce from the results, because as I mentioned, maybe some people think about acceptability in terms of what's socially acceptable. Maybe some people think about something that's more about what's true in the context. It is a concern of which it's really difficult to get rid of in this kind of experiment. I think it's something that's a concern for experimental studies of this type in general. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. So I had a question about the positive context. So it seemed that, like, in the example you used, it's like it's kind of positive because, like, actually Marco is a bad person, so then it's a bit more acceptable to call him to define him like that. And I was wondering if you also tested positive context where people reclaimed those pejorative terms. So for instance, let's say I'm speaking with my girlfriends and we have this habit of calling each other bitch. And so in our, like, social context, it's acceptable. Have you tested any of those positive contexts within the study?
No, so that's actually part of what we want to do next. So not specifically about the reclaimed uses, though I think that could be also an interesting thing to test. But So we went for, we tried to keep the formulation of a satisfying or positive context fairly uniform, so that we can get uniformity when we get to interpreting the results. And so we went for this fairly strong way of getting someone to deserve to be called in such a way, so to speak. So that it's not just that the speaker has a negative attitude, or not even that it's shared, but it's really that the person somehow is a jerk or whatever. And so what we would like to do, so actually when you look at the literature on pejoratives, as I presented it in the beginning, that's not what the literature usually assumes about the content of pejoratives. It assumes something weaker, namely that the speaker has a negative attitude. So one really interesting thing to test would be to see how the acceptability differs between just the speaker having this attitude versus the speaker and the rest of the audience having this attitude, but somehow not the attitude not being justified. And then like this context where it's not just that they have the attitude, but they should have the attitude in a certain sense. And then so that's the study that we plan to run. We wanted to test the differences between these three types of purely subjective, intersubjective, and then, so to speak, objective. I don't know whether like the reclaimed studies. So there's been a lot of discussion about those for slurs, but for pejoratives, not so much. But it's interesting that you brought up this example of bitch, because that's one that's well, that's debated whether it's a pejorative or it's a slur. Yeah, I mean, we haven't looked at any of those, but it would be interesting to see how those differ.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Derek?
So I was wondering whether it's so clear that the presupposition view should predict H1. And I was specifically thinking of towards the end when you're discussing the difference in acceptability between the predicative and referential uses in the control item. You consider the hypothesis that the referential uses require presupposition accommodation, and that results in lower judgments of acceptability. Mm-hmm. But if that is a reasonable hypothesis, then it seems like the same that the proponent of the presupposition view of pejoratives could appeal to it to explain your data, and so hence claim that they shouldn't be predicting H1 at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So, so there, when I was talking about the presupposition view, it was implicitly taken to be the Messiah and Schrenker view, and there are other types of a presupposition view that you could have. So, for instance, as we were just saying with the last question, you could have a different presupposition view that says that the presupposition triggered by say by jerk is not just that the speaker has the negative attitude, but that the person really is a jerk. So if you were to have this kind of a presupposition view, so one way of interpreting the results would be to say that so for the referential uses, I don't know how that would go for the predicative, but at least for the referential uses, such a view could say that it's much harder to accommodate the presupposition that someone is a jerk than the presupposition that someone is Sicilian or something else. So that kind of view would predict probably something more along the lines of H2, and that's the hypothesis that we think our study shows. We think that the study speaks against the presupposition view of pejoratives as it's run by Schlenker and Macias, and specifically Schlenker, because Schlenker, so he says that the presupposition is that the speaker has this attitude, and he has this further claim that so people would object, well, you can just use that even if your audience doesn't know that you have that. So he has this idea that those presuppositions are, I think he uses the term self-fulfilling. So basically that when you use an expression that triggers such a presupposition, it's automatically accommodated to the common ground. So we think that our results clearly show that that's not the case, that there is no such a automatic accommodation. But yeah, thanks for clarifying that.
Nicholas?
Hi, thanks for that great talk. It was very interesting. I had one question concerning, I was thinking that since both studies you ran were with students, I wondered whether we should be a bit more reluctant to say in general when pejoratives are acceptable based on this data, because I think it is at least very plausible to think that that the standards for the acceptability of pejoratives varies with social groups. So if you were doing the same sort of study with people with a lower education, I would expect that the pejoratives to be more acceptable for them in even in neutral contexts. So there might be a difference there, and that's something just to think about maybe.
Yes, I think that's a fair concern. We do draw this general conclusions, but so it was students because that was the easiest way of running the study, and at least for this a first study. So now that we have those results, which are fairly robust because it's still a large group of participants. It would be interesting to see whether we get the same results across. I think maybe not just social groups, maybe also like there could be a generation effect, maybe among senior people using such pejoratives is less common than younger people. I don't know whether what it would predict, but it is yeah, it's a fair concern. Yeah, I don't know. It would be interesting to see. I'm not sure whether there would be really much of a my hunch is that there could be some differences in the acceptability, but that overall we would still get a fairly what for us was the most important difference, which is that when you move from a pejorative to a neutral context, there is a much more significant drop in acceptability than for the controllers. My hunch is that we would still see that with other social groups, even if there might be some other differences in the acceptability. But yeah, thanks.
Sorry, related point to that?
Yes, it's just a question at this point. If suppose that you attempt other experiments and you find out that Nick is somewhat right and that there are indeed social differences, then what do you think would be the outcome? So that even if the differences were minimal, it seems to me that the existence of those differences in between social groups would speak against your conclusion, not in favor of it. Namely, it would seem that it is a matter of social acceptability more than a matter of linguistic acceptability, provided that the same language is the background of all the groups considered. Would this not be the case, you think?
So sorry, just so well, so there could be various things happening. So one of the things with these words is that for some social groups, something that one social group considers a pejorative is not for the other social group even a pejorative. They think it's just a way of referring to people, and so what that would, and then suppose that you get a social group where jerk is just like a way of referring to anyone, and they don't see anything bad about that. So then like one would expect that then jerk would sort of move towards behaving like a controller. And so it's not necessarily, it wouldn't necessarily show that what people are responding to is social acceptability. It's just that for such a group, of what one group takes as a pejorative would not even be a pejorative. So I think it would be interesting also maybe to check, with words which are like very mildly pejorative. So stanza is pretty strong, I think, in Italian, but I don't know. Yeah, I haven't even like really thought about, but some colloquial words which have this colloquial feeling, but they're not specifically bad. They're just ways. So what would be their behavior with respect to like strong pejoratives and fillers? Yeah, I think it's like all of that would be really interesting to test. Of course we had to like start from something, and that's actually, so when you look at our study, we didn't vary pejoratives. We really just like took one pejorative precisely because we didn't want, so sort of we tried to see what the difference is between the two extremes, and so getting like too many variation was likely to create things where you couldn't get any conclusions. So with this study, I mean, that's like either you get sort of really a lot of data and tons of participants so that you can get like statistically valid things, or you just like look at something that's more or less uniform. So in that respect, maybe it is a good thing that we only ran it on students at this point, so that it would be a uniform group of people who sort of all use the word in similar ways. But yeah, but the worry about when you ask someone how acceptable the sentence is, that different participants may be responding to different notions of acceptability, that still stays.
Deb?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. My question was related to the last two questions by Nicholas and Stefano. So I was wondering if you had thought about studying the same, making the same study in a different language, like English, for example, because I wonder whether, I mean, it's a bit of a stereotype, so I don't know whether it's actually true because I'm not an Italian speaker. But Italians use maybe a bit more pejoratives in their language than is the case in other languages sometimes. So yeah, it's related to the cultural / social kind of presuppositions that might be involved just specifically as a result of the language. So are you thinking of expanding that study to include non-Italian speakers, or maybe actually people who are bilingual, and seeing whether maybe one word which is a pejorative in two languages might have a slightly different kind of effect on both? And yeah, I was just curious to hear a bit more about that.
So as of now, for practical reasons, we are not really thinking about that sort of study. So we ran it in Italian because my two co-authors, well, especially Filippo, who is doing the all the all the field work, the experimental work. So he's based in Italy. So he's using the studies with participants from a university and getting this kind of setting right now for us in an English-speaking country is difficult. We could try to get to collaborate with a different person who would then do that at a different university. Another possibility would be to use something like the Mechanical Turk, which is like a platform that is often used for this kind of thing. But I think that one thing that's a bit difficult to control there is, well, precisely, what the background is and of the speaker. So that was one of the reasons why my collaborators were not so enthusiastic about trying to do that for English in this way. Now, ideally, yeah, it would be something that that in the future we would want to do. So I think the first step would be just to see to which extent the differences are replicated. So if we wanted to compare how much the language affects the acceptability of using slurs and pejoratives, and whether it's true that, say, in Italian people are more likely to use them than in English or in some other language, then getting this sort of comparison is trickier. But at least the first study that I think either we should do or someone else should do is really see whether we replicate this effect of the acceptability dropping in neutral context in, say, in English or in some other languages. So definitely it's something that that should be done in the future. Whether we are going to do it and when and how is a trickier question.
Thank you. Victor?
Yes. Hi.
Hi.
So my question is about linguistic acceptability and moral/social acceptability. So at first you distinguish the two notions, but then seeing that there is a drop in linguistic acceptability from a positive neutral context, not only when we go from controlled term to pejorative, but also from a non-pejorative negative term to a pejorative. I was wondering if the idea was that somehow the moral connotation or the sort of social standing of a certain term could influence linguistic acceptability. Like, is it a determiner of linguistic acceptability? As in, for example, like the worse the word is, then the more difficult it is to accommodate presuppositions, that sort of thing. Yeah, so that was my question is about the interaction of the two notions.
Right. So, that's really, I think, an open issue as to what explains why we get this drop in acceptability. So, one could think that it's just because, so suppose that the hypothesis is that we have it because, if you're calling someone in those, you're calling someone a jerk, like you're doing something sort of morally wrong towards this person. So we see that that's perfect, that like using pejoratives is perfectly fine in satisfying context. Well, perfectly fine. The participants judge pejoratives to be completely acceptable in satisfying context. Now, this still doesn't mean that that's not the right hypothesis, because the way we formulated our satisfying context sort of always said that the person did something bad, so it sort of justifies the moral use. So you could say, well, what we get with this difference is that each time you're calling someone with using a pejorative for someone, the speaker is doing something morally wrong. But in satisfying context, even though it's morally wrong to call someone with this pejorative, the other person did something even morally worse. So in a way, the speaker is justified. So that would be an explanation that would say, well, the linguistic acceptability is affected by moral acceptability. So that would be a possible explanation, but I think it's really an open issue. We don't know whether that's what's happening or whether there is simply something that whether there's something different. So as I think I don't remember who it was who was suggesting this, like a pragmatic weirdness. Maybe it's just that if you're out of a blue using a pejorative, it's not so much about morally acceptable, but like wondering why is the speaker now doing this thing, and so that's why it's sort of it's costly to accommodate something that's just kind of unexpected. So that could be an alternative hypothesis, and so so I think those are open issues. We don't really we can't see what's happening there. What we did see with the follow-up study, I think, is that we see that it's not just about saying something bad about someone, something negative about someone, because with the other words, like there were some which were really strong in the negative valence, and saying that someone is unbearable, and we still see that the pejoratives are much less acceptable than those.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
I mean, that those are just, so I think that our project it's just setting on a new research agenda where we are like seeing some differences that disconfirm some hypotheses that were made by the previous accounts, and what still needs to be done is see what the proper explanation of that is.
Thank you. I have a couple of hands which are still raised. Derek, Nicholas, are they new questions or from before?
I have not figured out how to lower my hand in Zoom, so
I'll lower it for you then. Derek, is that a question?
Yeah, I have more questions. So one of my questions, I think, is kind of anyway, it's also about the notion of acceptability. So I was thinking that predicative uses in both cases, both the pejorative and control cases, should be problematic in the positive context because they are sort of redundant or uninformative. I know that wasn't one of your hypotheses, and it doesn't fit your results either. So fair enough. But I guess I'm just wondering what people are tracking with this notion of acceptability if it doesn't include that kind of linguistic feature.
Right. Yeah. So for me also that was one of the surprising results. But then my colleague who is a psycholinguist sort of explained that you seem to get that because there is this kind of effect of priming, so in the context there people are already given the information, and then you have someone saying that. So I mean that would that would violate the Gricean maxim, like don't say something that's already known. But we see that people are very happy with that being acceptable. So two things. So one could, I mean, there are at least two explanations. One could be that it's just something that people are not really conscious about, but because they've already seen that, it's like comes down naturally that, that's fine. So you get this, okay. Yeah. The other would be that, the acceptability tracks also something. So it's not, so that it's more about what's the case and not just what's felicitous. So yeah, it's true that the results sort of are surprising in that respect, but the parent, I mean, it's as I mentioned, it's not something that this study shows against others. It seems to be something that's observed in other similar studies. Yeah.
So I wonder, can I ask one more thing, which is related to this? If so, one thought that I had about the way these cases are described is that at least most of them, it may be that the positive pejorative case you described is an exception to this, but at least most of them, it isn't really clear to me that it's built into the case that it is a positive or a neutral case. So just to explain what I mean, I think we can think about these cases as including two kinds of context. There's the fictional context of the context of Sarah and Luca in the story. And then there's the context of the participant in the study reading the story. So if you say Marco is Sicilian, that fact gets added to the context of the person reading the story, but it still isn't, it doesn't follow from that Sarah and Luca, that it's common knowledge among Sarah and Luca that Marco is Sicilian. So in a way, it's still, the story is still neutral as to whether that is a positive context or a neutral context. And likewise, I think in the other kind of cases where you just don't say anything in advance about whether Marco is Sicilian or who knows what about Marco's being Sicilian, it doesn't follow from that, I mean, maybe it's a kind of natural inference to make, maybe it is an inference people make, but it doesn't follow from that it's a neutral context. It's just neutral as to whether it's a neutral context. So I guess I was just wondering whether people's judgments about acceptability are tracking their context more than the fictional context in a way, because it tracking the information that they have as opposed to the information that the characters in the story have. If so, I wonder, well, I'm not exactly sure what that shows, because your data is still interesting, that, I mean, the differences you're finding are still interesting, even if that is so, but I guess it's less clear to me that you really, that how that bears on the hypotheses you started out with, once we take these different kinds of contexts into account.
Right. No, I mean, you are right. We sort of, that's why I would say things like the results speak against, but not really that they refute the hypothesis, precisely because you don't really know. So, I mean, there in this sort of study, what we get are some interesting differences. So that's, I think, already quite something, because, very often you just get sort of very mixed, things, no robust patterns. And here we see a very robust pattern. There is not, so another thing, so it can be seen on the graphs. I haven't really emphasized that, but it's that, when you look at the variations among speakers, so it's not that you're getting just like means, because say you could have one speaker who gives a very high acceptability and a different one that gives a very low acceptability. Actually, like, the participants are all behave very uniformly. So there are, of course, some differences, but there is really not like much of a difference in how different participants behave. So that's, I think, really, really nice about the study. So we get all those things. But of course, there are like lots of things that we can't discard as possible effects. So there was, like, we've already talked about that quite a lot, about, what if you ask a person how acceptable is this, how do they understand the task? And sort of, so we don't want them we don't want to give them instructions about, what acceptability is, because that's just more likely to confuse them. And, so we just sort of want to rely on the idea that this comes as close as anything else to what we want to see. And then you're absolutely right. that, you know, so there is a description of the context, but it's not so there is no further description about what the different participants in the context know or assume. So, you know, it's not, so we have a description like Marco is Sicilian, so ideally, like you might want to say, and Luca knows that, and Sarah knows that, and Sarah knows that Luca knows that, but you know, you don't, then it just becomes a very unnatural description, and so you lose what you want. So that's why we leave this this thing. And so, I mean, maybe like one thing that one could do in this sort of study is then like do those after study questions about, you know, how people understand what's happening there. So with the satisfying context for pejoratives, I think that, you know, the way they were formulated was that in general, the person who deserved the pejorative, it's not just that they did something bad which could pass unnoticed. They somehow behaved wrongly to the speaker and hearer, or to like people there. So then you would assume that both the speaker and the hearer know that this person did something bad. But yes, you're right that we were talking about why we get this high acceptability with predicative uses in neutral context. I mean, one explanation could be that after all, you know, the speaker, because you don't know whether the speaker whether the hearer knows that or not, maybe the speaker is not flouting the Gracian maxim, but maybe they are being informative. I don't know. I think that probably, you know, like when the participant just sort of goes through that, I mean, they're not, you know, sort of thinking, oh, like how informative is that, you know, I don't know. That's what I could say on this.
Thanks.
Stefano?
Okay, it's kind of a follow-up, I suppose. Well, it's related to what you were discussing right now with Derek. It's a very specific question, though. So in your results graph, so you know, I mean, the values for the positive scenarios for the referential and the predicative cases are different, or at least even slightly, but they are different.
For pejoratives.
In the positives, in both positive scenarios. So there seems to be a difference, even if minimal, between the predicative and the referential uses. I wonder, preliminary question, whether that's statistically relevant or whether that's just a feature of the setting. You know, if that's irrelevant. What is your explanation for this, even small, but, you know, for this difference in cases, and whether this is, I mean, I was thinking about something similar to what Derek was thinking about, but actually the other way around, namely, I was thinking something like, well, the referential use is in a way more accurate or acceptable because there is this feeling that it's already, that the information is implicit in what is already said. Well, there seems to be a factual check when it comes to the predicative, or satisfaction when it comes to the predicative case. I wonder if you have thoughts about this, or I don't know if it was.
I'm going back to the graph. Do people want me to share the screen or with the graph? Sorry. I'm getting lost a bit now. Apologies, I just got.
If you know the slide number, maybe I can put it up here myself.
I think I can. No, sorry. Just give me just a second. So I'm gonna fetch the graph so that we can see it. There I am. Okay, so this is the these are the results, and so Stefano was saying that with pejoratives, so we get. Can you see
Yeah,
the?
it's basically
Yeah.
my concern is that, well, from the graph, it turns out that in the two positive cases, the predicative and the referential case have, even if slightly different, but still have a slightly different outcome.
Yeah, so it is a small, it is a slight difference. It is significant. So here it's not marked, but it's basically like this one, because if you look at the controllers in the positive case are at the same acceptability, and so the pejorative in the referential case is more acceptable than in the predicative. So then your suggestion was that with when it's a referential, it was just something that's something that was there in the common ground, and then with the predicative, you sort of get to be checking facts. Can you?
Yeah, it's something. Well, it's actually even something even more minimal. I mean, it's just a random thought, so I don't. But I was thinking something like, well, in the referential case, there is no proper presupposition of satisfaction, if this makes sense. So I don't know, when I say something predicatively, I take it that the predicate objectively, with a lot of bracket, but objectively applies to the object, while in the referential case I might take it that there are some considerations that might limit the weight of that ascription. I don't know, this is just a random thought, but it seemed, I don't know whether you have some thoughts about it, or whether you actually thought about it.
No, I mean, we haven't. So we were surprised with this, like why we get this lower acceptability in the predicative case. And so that's why we ran this other study, because the natural hypothesis was that, just like you're saying something bad about someone. So like, why would you just say that? But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't really have further thoughts about what's happening there. Yeah, I really wouldn't like. There would all just be sort of possible kind of hints as to what might be happening, but I don't really know why. Like what could be the right explanation, and how one would go about checking whether that's the right explanation. One thing could also be that with these referential cases, it's something that is kind of very, very natural to use in a context where you already sort of know that this person is. It sort of comes as a natural way of referring to them, so that again, it's a question about what the speaker expects pragmatically, but I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't really wouldn't have further hypotheses or ideas as to what's happening there. Good enough.
Lynn?
Can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
So I was thinking that when you compared the projective case with controller case, it seems that you assumed that the two sentences are on bar in the sense that they both add new information to the common ground. But there's some possibility that some alternative explanation of projective, which is that it's just expressed the speaker's attitude. It's not adding new information to the common ground. I was thinking that does that difference in affect how you interpret the result?
So would that be specifically about, no, so that would be for both sorts of neutral and positive context.
Yes.
The difference. So, but so how would the, so sorry, I'm just trying to follow. How would this explain the difference that we get between the positive and the neutral context? So if it's just about the speaker expressing their negative attitude. So my worry there would be that, so I mean, we're talking about different, we have various differences, right, in what we see. So the most interesting one is that if you're in a context where it's already known that, say, the character Marco has done something bad, the pejorative, that jerk Marco, is perfectly acceptable. But if it's not part of the common ground, then it becomes less acceptable. So if it's about the speaker expressing their negative attitude, one would expect, one wouldn't expect such a drop in acceptability, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this could, I think this could be a way of explaining what we've just talked about earlier, where in, well, I don't really, so I agree that there, so saying that, you know, in the predicative case could be about adding information to the common ground, whereas the referential case is not about adding information. I mean, it's like adding different information, like that the person has arrived and then has this like additional expression of the person's negative attitude. So that's what most of the accounts of pejoratives sort of predict. Is three spots account really, I mean, that's what it does. So I'm fine with this being like two different cases between the predicative use and the pejorative and the referential use, that the different things are going on, that with the predicative it's added to the common ground, whereas with the referential it's part of expressing the speaker's negative attitudes. But what I'm missing in your suggestion is how this sort of maps to the differences that we get in our study. What exactly, how that would explain the difference between pejoratives and controllers, for example, and the difference between neutral and positive context.
I need to think about it.
I think it would be, yeah, I think it's a perfectly fine hypothesis. It's actually part of the existing account of pejoratives. I think, well, the existing accounts of pejoratives really focus on the referential because they are about expressing this derogatory attitude, whereas, you know, predicative uses are put aside. But it would still, I think, I don't know. I'm also going to think about whether that difference could account for some of the differences that we find in the study.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if there are any further follow-up questions. Very well. Okay, so thank you again.
Well, thanks for the really valuable discussion and for listening. If you have questions that you think about later on, feel free to email me or me and my colleagues.
Very good. Thank you very much. Hope anyway, look after yourself. Yes, as we are all.
Same.
And thank you very much. I will be in contact with you with the recording as well before we can publish it as well.
Thanks so much. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye.